the going gets tough, you know that it's like that light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, things are gonna get better.
Yeah.
But you just gotta have trust. You gotta have faith.
Yeah.
You gotta trust in the. It's like trusting the process.
I agree.
Kind of thing.
I agree. Yeah, definitely.
So that's personally how I take it and how I look at it.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, it's easier said than done. A lot of people hear that and they think, oh, like peace in the storm, or I can do that. Mm-hmm. I said the same thing until I go through my own storm and I'm like, what is going on? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to base this off Matthew chapter 14 verses 22 to 32. If you guys want to join us in at your home or wherever you listen to, by all means, if you're listening, then that's fine. But we're going to read from that on, and that's kind of what we wanted to base it off of as well. And Matthew 14, chapter 20 to 32 says this: Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffed by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And then it goes on. This part gets me. It says, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out and set his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. I mean, that, to me, that's a really powerful, part of the scripture. And to give it a little bit of a background, before that, Jesus was teaching, and there was a miracle that he performed where he fed the 5,000. And it's funny because they would have thought that by that miracle alone, they would have known that Jesus could have done anything, right? But that wasn't the case. When they literally witnessed Jesus feed 5,000 people with just, I think it was like 3 loaves of bread and 2 fish.
That's right.
Which is something that's unheard of. That's never happened. That's a miracle. But that's kind of like the basis to understanding what's going on, because oftentimes in our lives, even in the times that we're at, how can I say this? We're in a good drift with God in our lives. We're doing good with God. We've seen God perform miracles in our lives, and we're able to offer advice to others and say, "Hey, man, God's there. He's always there," and stuff like that. And you know that God's there, but then there's moments where you're confronted with a storm. You find yourself in the middle of the storm, and oftentimes as Christians, we see that happening. We see that happening in the sense of how can I explain this? We forget about all the miracles that God has done in our lives, and we focus solely on the storm, like Peter did, because Peter literally stepped out and walked on the water. When I first read this the first time ever, I thought to myself, why would this man, knowing that he's standing on water, doubt that?
That's right.
But we can't say that because we weren't in that position. See, all Peter had to do was focus on Jesus. But instead, he focused on everything that's around him. And that's what led to him starting to sink. And to me, that's exactly, the aspect of that. That's exactly what we need to see, is that we can't be the example how Peter was and doubt God by looking at the storm that we're in our lives and saying, what am I supposed to do? Because that's the moment where we do start to sink. If you wanted to add anything, please, by all means.
Well, I actually think that there's another story as well that is very close in relation, as far as, it's very similar. And it's actually in Mark chapter 4. And I hope you don't mind that I read this story.
Go for it.
And really, again, you'll see the similarities. So Mark chapter 4, verse 35 says, "That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There was also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?"
Wow.
And so,
Wow.
I think that both of these stories, can really be intertwined so much with what we're living today.
I agree.
Right? And so, for instance, in your story, Jesus tells them, "Let's go out onto this boat," right? And so, and in mine, on verse 35, the first thing that it says is that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." And so my biggest thing that I kind of notice as far as those words is, let's not go under, let's not go around, but let's go over. And so why is that so important, or why is that so critical? And it's, to me personally, it's because just like in your story, when he called Peter out, Jesus didn't say you would drown on the way to your destination, right? He said that you're going to arrive there.
Yep.
And so that's why I think this is so important, why it's so critical to understand these two stories. And, personally, I'd love to give a breakdown piece by piece. And I'd also love to hear, what you have to say.
No, I mean, and that's the thing, what really got me was that in both occasions, in both accounts of the story, Jesus knew that it was going to happen. Mm-hmm. He sent them out on their boat, and in Mark 4, he went on the boat. But if you notice, he was asleep.
That's right.
He was asleep.
We're gonna get there.
He was asleep. But that's the crazy part, because immediately in the account of Matthew, you see that Jesus was praying the entire time. Jesus was aware of what was going on. Mm-hmm. And there was a time that he allowed for them to go through that before he showed up, because it had to happen that way. However, that doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't there with them. He was always there with them, because you got to understand, whatever storm it was, the storm could have easily taken them out, and that was it, if it wanted to. But that wasn't the case. It didn't. The whole time, even though Jesus wasn't there at the moment, he was still in control.
That's right. I think the biggest thing, and this I had kind of had on, jotted down on a little bit further down on my notes. That it's really easy to say, on both occasions, oh, well, Jesus was there back then with them. So, well, of course they're going to feel safe, or, he was physically there, but here's the not funny thing, but here's the incredible thing. The word says that Jesus became flesh, so on that he would take on absolutely everything that man could, so that way he could be merciful. In other words, so that way he could understand the things, the trials and the tribulations that we go through. Yes. Even the temptations. Yes. Jesus himself was tempted for 40 days.
Yes, I agree. And that's the thing, though. The biggest aspect that we need to understand, especially when we want to achieve that peace in the middle of the storm, is understand that the storm that we're going through doesn't mean that it's the end of things. We need to understand that, yes, our boat may be in pieces right now. It may seem like it's going to sink, but it's not. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. In Mark, if you read Mark very carefully, it talks about the water was coming into the boat. That's already. Right.
It was almost.
It was already about to sink.
Exactly.
But Jesus, he wasn't even worried about it. The man was sleeping. Imagine that.
Well, here's the thing, and just to kind of, piggyback off of our points is, we're talking about. He became so much flesh that he even grew tired after his ministry. In other words, after preaching and serving, he was flesh. He was tired. He was exhausted. Yeah. So even he would go to, he would go to sleep. I mean, yeah. And you kind of think of, okay, well, Jesus did all these miracles. Of course he's godly. He is God. It's part of the Holy Trinity, but he was also human. Yes. And so he once again, he understands the things that we go through, in those trials and those storms that, that we face.
No, and that you're right. You're right. See, and I feel like in part of that, even though Jesus went to sleep, he knew that God was in control.
Oh yeah.
He knew he knew everything was in control. And that's the aspect, that's a huge aspect that we need to really understand, that in our time of going through that storm, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by everything that's being thrown at us. It's really easy to think, why, God? Why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? But that's not the question that you should be asking yourselves. The question is not why, but for what. What is this for? What are you trying to teach me? What are you trying to get me through? What is what is your purpose in all of this? Because in everything that happens in our lives is a purpose and a meaning behind it. The whole point of Jesus walking on water, it wasn't so he can just flaunt another miracle in their faces. It was to teach a lesson. It was teach a lesson in the sense of, even Peter was like, let me walk towards you. Sometimes as humans we're quick like, God, I want to show you my greatest, how faithful I am to you. He was like, all right, I'm gonna test you. And that was the whole point.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Sometimes going through the storm is necessary.
Yes.
Verse 36 in Mark follows, and it says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. And the reason why I mention this and why I think it's so important is because sometimes we become complacent where we're at, right? It's really easy for us to stay where we are because we're comfortable. I mean, for instance, look at me. I'm dressed up right now, shirt and tie. Last week I came and I was already dressed down. Yeah. Right. And so again, I was thinking on my way here, I was like, God, is this you not wanting me to get complacent?
Yeah.
And I was like, and I know it's silly to think, an outward appearance.
Yeah.
But it's I don't know. I just kind of think a little bit more further than that.
Yeah. And I'm
no,
sorry,
absolutely. Go ahead, please.
I don't mean to cut you off. And that, again, what you mentioned about comfort, being comfortable is something that I feel is extremely dangerous, especially to youth today. Because especially now that we're separated, not being able to go to church as much, not being able to really be able to spend time with those that can really encourage us to be better with Christ and, in our walk with Christ. It's easy to get complacent and comfortable with the things that we do at home. And complacency and comfortability is a dangerous thing in your walk with God. I've learned that the hard way for myself. I've learned that every time. That's why I know when I'm going through something, it's because, every time I get comfortable in a certain area, God always has to kind of send something in my way to get me up and move, because I get too comfortable and I start to sit down. And once you start to sit down and get comfortable, you get lazy. Yeah. You get lazy in your walk with God. You get lazy whether it's in your prayer with God, whether it's in your talking with God. And I have found that even in this time of quarantine, that was my biggest struggle. Because when I wasn't working, I was at home, I was chilling out, I was throwing my feet up, I was watching TV, playing games. And I was like, wow, I'm really letting this, take all of my time, when I should really be able to take that, sacrifice that, and really take time with God. And I found that, and I know that it's something small. But you have to understand, for the youth, you guys need to understand that when you're comfortable like that, you don't hear, as a tendency that you won't necessarily hear the voice of God like you should. And that goes into another different topic. I'm not gonna get into that just yet.
Yeah, that's right. You know what? I agree with you 100%. Because, with being in quarantine and so on and so forth, in this time, the first thing that I said is, you know what? God is doing this because he wants us to draw nearer to him. Yeah. Right? He's the excuse of, I don't have enough time is that's out the window. You got enough time now. It's up to you. Right? Yeah. And so I think it also comes down to, as far as being complacent, is also in your environment. So for instance, I mentioned this quote one time during our youth service a couple months back. And it was, a shark in a fish tank will grow 8 inches, but in the ocean it will grow to 8 feet or more. The shark will never outgrow its environment, and the same is true about you. Many times we're around the wrong crowd, and it hinders us from being able to grow. No. Or again, we become complacent in our normal daily routines, where in those moments where we say, you know what, hey, I'm gonna actually, I'm gonna settle down, I'm gonna buckle down, and I'm gonna do what I need to do so that way I can grow closer to Christ.
Yeah.
It just never happens.
Yeah.
Because we don't actually take that step forward. And again, we sit down, we got the TV right next to us, we got our phones in our hands.
Yeah.
And it's so easy once again to just to become that couch potato.
Yeah. And that's the thing, I feel like it's funny how God is and how he works, all this is happening right now is all a part of God's will. Mm-hmm. It has to happen. Everything that's happening in the world, the word says it
exactly. It's written.
And what's happening now, especially with the youth, being in quarantine, being at home, to me is something that God, has made me understand is that just because you're at home doesn't mean, just because you're away from church doesn't mean that you can't go to church. And I say that because the Bible says where 2 or 3 are gathering my name, there I am. And it specifically says, even at your own home, you can be the church at your own home. You can start a little church service at your own home.
Oh man,
Karina and I do that sometimes. Recently we're trying to get into the habit of doing that because I was like, all right, babe, I think that we should get together. We need to pray, play some music, and we have our little own session at home. Just because you're not at church doesn't mean that you can't bring the church home. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we need to understand. Because the moment that we think that church is only in here, in this building, is the moment where we lose. Because that leads to a lot of different things.
Last Wednesday we had our Wednesday Bible study on Zoom, and it's so funny. Again, this is not something that's planned, guys. Ricardo and Karina last Wednesday, you guys weren't on, right? You guys were, thank God you guys were taking, some family time, some much needed family time. So, amen to that. But, we, the youth last Wednesday were having our Bible study on entering into God's presence. And, one of the questions that I asked the youth was, where do you feel like you most feel God's presence? And, quite a few of them actually said in church. And I'm like, okay. And so, others said, whether it's, when they're dancing at church or whether they're in the youth room was one of the answers.
Yeah.
And, although it's, it's beautiful to hear, that they enjoy being at church and that, they enjoy being in communion with the others, that are here. Yeah. But the biggest thing is the misconception of to being in God's presence, you have to be at a physical location.
Oh yeah.
You see, and part of the class last Wednesday, and again, this is another conversation, but back in the Old Testament, what was the way of being in God's presence? The tabernacle.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it's amazing how only 2 chapters of the entire Bible were dedicated to the creation of universe, but over 50 chapters were dedicated to this tabernacle. Why? Because again, it was think about it like a church on wheels. They would set it up, right? They would set it up. They would bring it down, and then whenever they got to their next destination point, they would set it back up again. Yeah. And again, it was so holy and it was so specific in dimensions and it was so detailed that you couldn't even go into the tabernacle itself. And I'm kind of getting on. I'm getting off topic, but you're gonna get my point.
I get it. Go ahead.
So so you couldn't even get into the tabernacle to where, quote unquote, where God's presence was, where he dwelled. That's the definition of a tabernacle, a dwelling place, right? And so, you couldn't even get into the tabernacle. You can only get into the courtyard, right? And so only the priest would be able to go in there once a year, and so on and so forth. Anyways, just giving you guys a little quick history lesson on that part. So my thing is, when Jesus came, right? He became flesh, he died, and he resurrected. At that point was when Jesus lived within us. God lived within us. And so, my biggest thing here was, as far as the question is, and actually JB had mentioned the perfect word. It's having the conscious decision of knowing that God lives within us, which means we are never alone and we're not the only ones going through this. He is always there. We're always in his presence. We just have to know that he's there.
Yes. Wow, that's you really hit that on the head. And it's funny because, if we go to Acts and we read all about the history of the church, how it started. They started in a house. Mm-hmm. The church didn't start in no building. They all started in a house. And when you really go through Acts, and I recommend you guys to really read through Acts and study it, it talks every account that's happened where the Holy Spirit will manifest was they would go to someone's house. It was always that way. And it wasn't until later on that they built the church, they built the buildings and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But when they talked about the church in the New Testament, it wasn't a building, it was the people. Mm-hmm. They were the church. They were the body of Christ.
That's right.
And that was essentially the whole point. In the times that we go through, especially now, we're not alone. We're not the only ones. And something that you brought up about in Mark 4, where he says that they weren't the only ones in the water that day.
You got it.
They weren't the only ones.
You got it.
And that's the thing. You guys aren't alone. You're not the only ones going through it. Mm-hmm. And that's something that for me personally, God has taught me. God has been teaching me hard. I'll be real with you guys. This from last Tuesday up until today has been probably the hardest week I've had so far. And it was a very challenging week. It was very challenging for my wife and myself. And I finally, out of all of that, I learned how to really be at peace and through everything that I'm going through in my life, to not let that storm overwhelm my life. Because that was the moment that you let that overwhelm your life, like Peter did, you start to sink. Mm-hmm. You start to fall. You begin to doubt God. You begin to, you go through the darkest moment. But when you focus on Jesus, when Jesus took his hand, immediately he came right back up. And the interesting part about all this that it goes on, when he steps on the boat, it's gone.
That's right.
And that's the point. When you allow Jesus to come and really be the center of it and understand that Jesus is the center of it, even with the storm that you're going through, that peace, nothing can surpass that peace that God puts in you. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny because sometimes we have a tendency to think, when is this over? When will this end? And we get so frustrated with my God, why does this keep happening? Why is this still happening to me? And one point that I had is that understanding that getting through it is not on our time, but on God's.
It's so funny that you mentioned this, and I'm sorry that I kind of chuckle, but when I was going over, these talking points and asking, God, lead me into the, into the path that you want me to, and I was just kind of trying to bring different analogies maybe and so on and so forth. And I'm like, what, forget it. But then it instantly hit me, and it was, have you ever seen the movie Are We There Yet? With Ice Cube?
Oh, yes. I remember that movie.
I mean, but it's like exactly the same. Like, hey, are we there yet? And then thing after thing after thing continued to happen to them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he got attacked by a deer. His
car set on fire.
His car got set on fire. But my point with this is that, when God tells you that he's going to help you through something, believe that he's going to get you through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's understanding, again, just like you had said, that getting through it is not on our time, but on God's time, and knowing that God is in control overall, especially, right now during the tribulations that we're going through, whether it's COVID-19, the rioting and the destructions, it's easy, just like you had mentioned earlier, it's easy to fear. And as human, it's honestly common and it's normal. The disciples were scared. They went and they woke up Jesus in that, in Mark.
Yeah.
And so it's just understanding that just because we are not there yet doesn't mean that we're finished, right? It doesn't mean that God's plan for us is done.
Yeah. And that's the thing, I know I relate a lot to what I go through in my life, but it's like all these things that really hit me. when we bring this stuff to you guys, this is something that God personally speaks to my life throughout the week, throughout everything that, we've been going through recently. This is something that God has really been teaching me and, speaking to me about. And it was funny because, we hit a point, recently, Karin and I, we got to praying, and I was asking, God, I was like, God, I don't know what else to do. And we just started worshiping. And it's funny because all I heard was him say, I'm still working. Be patient. I'm still working. I'm still in control. And it was just like, wow. Like, yes, you are still working. I believe that. Yes, I believe that. But see, the problem is it's easy at that moment. But what happens when you have to face the storm and you have to tell yourself that every time? It's not that easy. And that's the part that we really need to get it through our understanding, our thought process, that what we're facing isn't the end of us. What we're facing isn't the end of God. To say, oh God, obviously you haven't gotten me out of it. I don't know what else to do. I'm stuck. You're putting a limit on God. You're putting a limit on what God can do. You're pretty much cutting God halfway, and you're saying, look, I don't care. I don't care if you're still working. Obviously, I'm not seeing it, and this is frustrating, and I want to give up. And that's easy to happen, especially now because, for the youth, for all you guys that are listening, it's easy to get, when you're not around your friends, those that can really encourage you and help you. Like I said, it's really hard to really get lost in the thought process of that. And that's why I tell you guys, please don't think that you're alone in this, because you're not alone.
And one thing that you had mentioned earlier that I absolutely love, and I think I've mentioned it multiple times before. In fact, I sent you a text message on it, telling you how much I loved this saying. It's, we don't need to know the why, but we need to know for what.
Yes.
And so, man, when I tell you that this hit me a few days ago, even before me, receiving these, the talking points and your ideas, was, sometimes we're so blinded by our own selfishness and our fears as far as facing the storms that we don't see the plan and the purpose that God has for us during those times, or even after. And watch what I get. This is why I get, I say after. So instead of asking why this is happening to me or why I'm going through this, our mentality should be for what? Lord, why is it important for me to go through this? Right? For what is it important for me to go through is this? Use me as an instrument, and how can I serve you? And so the reason why it's so interesting that on the other side of that lake in Mark, before them going through that storm, the reason they needed to go through that storm, one of the reasons was because they were preparing, because there were 2 demon-possessed men that needed them. So are you going to go into some place where your faith is not where it needs to be at?
Yeah, you're right. Oh, yeah.
I mean, are you going to go out and cast out demons when you yourself are in the world? Oops.
Nah.
I'm going to drop the mic.
That's tough. No, but yes. Before anything, I'm sorry. Again, thank you guys for joining in. You guys are listening to 97.3 WMFJ, Oasis radio station, the first and only Spanish radio station of all of Augusta. We thank you guys for joining in. Again, please, if any of you that just hopped on and are listening, if you feel free to call us at 706-793-8600. Please feel free. If you guys want to share anything, you want to share a testimony, or you simply want to share something that God has spoken to you about, please feel free. We are more than willing to hear from you guys, because this is what we're doing. We want to hear from you guys. We want to see what you guys may be going through. If you guys have any prayer requests, please feel free to as well. Again, thank you guys for all that you've done. Also, you guys can join us, download the app 97 Oasis on the Apple Store or the Google Play as well. I'm sorry. And again, thank you guys for joining in. For all of you there on Facebook, I see that there is Sheila, Vanessa. I know I saw Lexi in there too. Thank you guys for joining in. I'm sorry, we're still trying to go through everybody that's on there. But, again, for all of you that have joined in, whether on YouTube, whether on Facebook, please, thank you guys. Please feel free to share it on your Facebook or with your friends. And, again, thank you guys. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a quick break. We're going to play a song. We want you guys to really just take a moment, talk with God, really worship God. Just have this moment with God, and we will be right back with you in a few moments.
Yo soy hijo
So we are back. So again, thank you guys so much for joining. Again, we are at the 3265 Deans Bridge Road. We are at you are listening to 97.3 WMFJ Oasis Te Bendice. Once again, for everyone that is connected, please, if you have any kind of testimonials, you want to join on, you want to share your thoughts, you want to share absolutely anything that you guys have as far as regarding to what we're talking about today, you can reach us at 706-793-8600.
Yes. Thank you guys again for joining in. You know, it's been a real blessing to see what God wants to do with us and everything that he's been trying to do, you know, for us and through us and for the youth and all this stuff. And again, you know, really thank you guys for joining in. And I know that this is a huge blessing. Please feel free to share it. Just share it. You know, that's the best way that you can help in sparking this revival, you know, all over the world. We want this to be heard. We want kids to be able to have that purpose and understand that God has a way for them. Again, so we're going back to, you know, what we were talking about was peace in the middle of the storm. And one thing that it's funny to me, because something that God, you know, would bring to mind is that sometimes I would get overwhelmed and think that there's no way out. And we have to think, you know, there's always a way out, you know. And it's funny because we think, oh, what's the way? The answer is simple. God's the way. He is the way. He is the answer. He's the way out. When we put our focus and our understanding on God and know that even in the middle of the storm, he's there. He's with us. We can that's the way through it. That's the way out of it. Because we have to understand, like you said, there's no way around the storm but through it. There's no other way around it. You can't go around it. You can't kind of like, no, you got to go through it. That's really the whole point. Because what happens is, you know, we see the storm and we say, oh, I don't want none of that. I want to find my own way around. And we'll try to do that. But what happens is something happens. We go through stuff. We could find ourselves sinking. We can find ourselves hitting a point where we realize that we made the wrong turn. And I think that the funny part is that God waits. God waits. God waits for us to really, for us to learn our lesson. Because like, again, for me, it was like, I hit a point, you know, I was where I would try to go through things on my own. And I was like, all right, you know, I was like, I really need help. Please pray for me. And at that moment, things got a whole lot easier. And I was like, God, why? You know, what's going on? Why? And it was funny. He said, I let you go through it because you needed to learn. You needed to learn that you're not the only one through this. And I was like, I'm such an idiot. Like, wow, like, why didn't I see that? I thought that I could do it on my own. I thought I could find my own way. But clearly that my way through it was not alone, was with my wife, was with, you know, the church. And that's essentially the point for all of us here, for the youth that are listening. The way out is with God, but also don't think when I was talking about, and I wanted to bring this up earlier, when I was talking about how you can be the church at home, I'm not saying don't come to church when it actually opens up. We are actually open now. And yes, we take every precaution we need to make sure that everyone is safe. You know, and it's something that I was told, and it was, just because you're going through the storm doesn't mean that you can't go to church. Just because you're going through a rough time doesn't mean that you still can't go to church, can't pursue God. Because the moment that you stop doing that, the moment you stop coming to church, the moment you stop trying to do works for God, that's the moment where the enemy will take to really bring us down. Because that's the moment we start to separate slowly and surely. We start to drift away from God and what he wants for us and what he has for us. So I don't know. Obviously I wanted you guys to know that there has to be a balance between the two. Don't think that the church is the building. You are the church, but also think that going to church, it's not about that's where you can experience God the most, but that's where you can meet with others that have gone through similar situations or are going through similar situations that can pray for you, that can help you, that can encourage you. And I think that's the essential point of all this. And if you have anything else to say, please, you know, feel free.
No, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Especially just so people can have kind of like a visual. Think about it this way. When you're in church, and even though you're going through your trials and your tribulations, and you're still going through and you're still pushing through and you're going to church, think about it this way. It's the enemy has you locked and loaded. But the moment in time that you stop going or you just give up and you lose faith and you lose hope and you stay home and you stop trying to pursue God, that's when he's really just it's a knockout. He's already gotten you.
Yeah.
So kind of think about it that way. As far as what you started with, as far as God is the way out, one thing that kind of reminds me of to both our stories was